Okay, everyone, so we are back for the last of our regex fun here, in which we are attempting to create a new column in our data file that includes true if the phone number column has a 212 in it and false if it doesn't. And of course, this isn't necessarily particularly useful except dividing the outer boroughs from Manhattan, as most of these probably have their phone numbers from way back in the day when 718 was outer boroughs only and 212 was Manhattan only, though no longer the case. But anyhow, it gives us a window into how we would approach this problem. Approach this process using Python. So we've done a pretty decent job here. We're not all the way there. We know that we have our data printing out. We have this information coming up in the case where we see our 718 area code. We're cool because we're seeing false, and when we have a 212 area code, we verified earlier that we were seeing true. So we feel pretty good about that our regular expression is working. That's always a nice thing. And now we need to kind of address, we've got our number 3 here, use my regex to test whether that column has 212. And now we're getting back to the part where we want to create a new column that contains true if 212 is present, false otherwise. So one thing that we haven't addressed here is that we had these we had columns of data, and now we've kind of, as we can see from our print statement, we've got a couple of problems. So first of all, we seem to be testing our header row for whether or not it contains 212, which is of course meaningless. What we really want to do is have our header row, we need to create a new header for our new column of data, right? And then we also need to sort of recombine these things that we've broken up into a comma separated, into a set of comma separated rows of data, so that we can, use them as a regular CSV. So the first thing I want to address is this header column problem. So if we go back here and say, okay, if position equals 6, so if position equals 6, and I'm in row 0, right, which is my first row, because we noted that header row is 0 and phone column is index 6. If we find that we're in that position, then what we really want to do is we want to add a new column name. And so I'm going to take this if position equals 6, and there's a couple different ways that I could do this. It's completely stylistic, which one you want to do. I can say, well, okay, if I'm in position 6, I can test, I still have access to row num, and I can say, okay, if row num equals 0, right? So in the case where I'm both at position 6 and row num 0, then I can say, well, I want you to print out, and again, we're still in the print phase here. I want you to print out, let's see, let's call it is 212, right? And I'm going to go back to this idea of sort of saying what it is. And now I get into this question where I want to say, okay, okay, so I've said, if I'm in my header row, if I'm in position 6 and I'm in my header row, then I want to print this new header. Now, if the row number isn't 1, so in any other case, I want to, but I'm in, if I'm not in row 0 and I'm not in, but I am in position 6, then I want to use my regex thing, right? And so what I can end up with here is I want to say something like, okay, else, so if I'm in row number 1, do this. Otherwise, what I want to do is the rest of this stuff. So what I'm getting to here is what's known as nested conditionals. So basically, I'm first testing, I'm saying, look, if I'm in position 6, then I need to do something with this information, because I'm actually not touching the rest of the file, right? I want to keep the rest of it as it is. And I say, okay, if I'm in the header row, then, so I'm going to say, here, if I'm in header row, create new column name. And then I'm going to say otherwise, right? Basically, otherwise, use my regex to test whether that column has 2 and 2 in it or not, right? I'm going to put a little space in here so it's a little bit more readable. Okay, so I'm going to say here, if I'm at my target column, whose index is 6, right? So I've kind of reminded myself up there. Okay, so if I'm at 6 now, if I'm in the header row, I want to create a new column name. That seems good. Otherwise, I want to test it for the regex. And now way down here, I'm saying, okay, so if position equals 6, then I'm going to do all this stuff. Otherwise, all I want to do is print out the value. I mean, that's all I want because I'm not changing it at all. So what I want to look for is whether it seems like this true false thing is already working. I want to see if I get a new header row here. And actually, I probably want to print both the current header row value and is 2 and 2 because I need to add it, right? So let's see what happens here. So if I go back up to the top again, I'm going to see, great. Okay, so it looks like I've added, so I see both phone and is 212, but this still is kind of messy. What I really want is I want to bring this stuff back into a single row. And so what I need to do is make sure that I add my commas back in. So when I split on commas, I ended up breaking my row that had commas in it into a list that now has become vertical. So I want to kind of gather that all back together and actually get those commas back. So I can do that simply by just saying, look, every time I print a value, also put a comma after it, right? And I'll get the same thing here. So I can say, oh, okay, well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to say comma, right, comma. And in doing this, I'm going to sort of rebuild the idea of my comma separated file. So let's give this a run and see. What I want to see is, that's right, I want to see a comma after everything because that means that when I output it to the file, I'm going to get something that looks like the comma separated value that I started, comma separated file that I started with. So I seem to have some weird space in there. Oh, interesting. Does that fix it? That's strange. Oh, because I have a comma there, not a plus, right? So I want to do that concatenation. Let's try that again, just make sure that so what I was reacting to there was I was seeing phone and then a space before my is 2 and 2. Now this looks a little bit more normal, right? Because when we think about it, we see it all crammed up together on the same line. Now I am noticing one other thing that's happening here, which is what's going on at the end. Where is that? So where does my data end? I need to look for a stab note. Oh yeah, I'm ending up with this comma kind of hanging off the end here, out in the middle of nowhere. And that's actually because when I do this way, I end up with a comma after my last data value, which I don't really want, right? If we recall when we're writing lists, it's sort of the way we write lists in English, right? We would want to say something like, apples, oranges, I can never spell this stuff, oranges and bananas, right? But we don't put a comma after bananas. We only put it between items of a list. So I don't want to have that last one. So the way that I can do that is I can do, again, a nested if statement here. I can say, well, listen, if now what I'm looking at is position, if position equals, and now this is where we can see it comes back, the position of the last data column is 46. If position equals 46, then I just want to print value, okay? Else, right? Otherwise, I want to print value plus a comma, okay? So this part is going to be, I'm going to get rid of this comment. So if I'm my target, whose target is 6, and then here I'm going to put my comment that says, if I'm not in my target column, just print the value plus a comma. And then I'm going to say, unless I'm at the last column, in which case, no comma, right? Okay, so let's give this one more run. We're going to see if we end up, what we want to see is, we want to see this comma disappear, right? We want to see that get lopped off. So give it a go. And actually I can see right at the end here, my 2 is just a 2, there's no comma after it. So I feel pretty good about this. And now I just have one thing left to do, which is I need to save a new copy of the file with the new column. Okay. So if I were in OpenRefine right now, I've done the equivalent of opening my file. I opened my file, I broke it into rows, I broke those rows into columns, right? Which is essentially what OpenRefine does for us, kind of all in one fell swoop right in the beginning. And then rather than doing this sort of, in this case, when I say if position equals 6 is basically the part where I sort of navigate to, I right click on the column and I say create a new column based on this column. And if I remember that dialog box that comes up, that's where I put in the header value of my new row, of my new column rather, and then I create this match function with my regular expression, and I say, listen, if it matches this regex, I want you to put in true, and if it doesn't match it, I want you to put in false, and then it generates that new column. And now I'm at that point where I want to actually create an output file for this, so where I would go to export and OpenRefine and say, save this out as a CSV. So in the case of what we're going to do is we're going to create a new variable called output file. Now here's the interesting thing. When I first create a file in most programs, this actually isn't the case with Refine, but when I first create a file in most programs, what do? I say, I actually open a new file, right? And it often doesn't make me save it until I've put stuff into it. But in this case, we need to name it right away, right? So we don't have to name it until we go, Apple S or whatever and it says, well, what do you want to call this thing after all? We need to tell it what we want to call it right at the beginning. So we actually use the open a new file is going to be the file that we write to, is going to be our output file. So I'm going to say ctown with 212.csv, right? So I'm going to put the extension right in there. And if you remember from the Reshkov, he makes this mention of, a world where data was writable as well as readable. So we're going to actually put a W in there, and that's going to be the signal to the computer that this is a writable file, right? We want to be able to put stuff in here. And now we can basically just take our existing syntax that we had and say, look, oops, that's an old thing. And basically say, all we want to do is we want to write to that file. So basically, instead of printing things out to this console window, I want to write them to that file. So I take my little print statements, and instead I'm going to say output file dot write and pass it these values. And actually, I'm looking at it now and I'm realizing my is212 needs a comma after it as well, right? As does probably my true and my false. Because otherwise, if I look back up at some of my test values here, right? Yeah, see, is212 doesn't have a comma after it, right? So it's going to run in to this header, and likewise, my test value, where are you, test value, right, is also not going to have a comma after it. So we want to make sure that we have those there. Oops, I lost my... So we see how our typography is helping, right? And that green means that it's seeing it as a string. So here we go. Let's give this a go and see what happens. Oh, and sorry, actually, one last thing before we do this. This would actually probably work fine even if we didn't do this, but we're going to go ahead and close our output file before we run this program, just so it knows that we're done with it. It's helpful. All right. Oh, right, we didn't finish writing everything to the output. So output file dot write is going to replace this print statement. So I realize there's kind of a lot going on here, but I think as we work through it in class, you guys will get a handle on it. And I just really want you to stick to this, thinking about this as a parallel to the activities we're already doing in Google Refine. It is a bit more involved, obviously, but as we'll see, assume we don't get any, oops, uh-oh, we got some problems. Oh, sorry, equals close, output file dot close. There you go. All right, so I'm going to take a second and open up my file, and you see it's created this new file for me, and everything looks good. Yay! All right, so we will obviously go over all of this in class, but please, hopefully you guys have gotten some of this out of watching these videos, and when we go through it in class, we will go through any questions you may have. All right, have a great weekend.